Saskatchewan, summer of 1946. A flat field stretches to the horizon, baked under a white prairie sun. Trainers sit wingtip to wingtip in silence. Yellow paint fading, engines cold, no propellers turning, no cadets in blue filing toward the flight line. Just row after row of aircraft, motionless in the heat. 1 year earlier, this place roared with the sound of radial engines from dawn to dusk, producing aircrews for a war that shook every continent. Now it is an auction lot. The men are gone, the mission is over, and Canada's wartime air empire is about to vanish almost overnight. In December of 1939, representatives from Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand signed an agreement that would quietly become one of the most ambitious military programs of the Second World War. It was called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. The concept was direct. Canada would become the primary training ground for Allied air crew, taking in young men from across the Commonwealth and preparing them to fly, navigate, bomb, and operate wireless sets in the skies over Europe, the Atlantic, North Africa, and the Pacific. The plan would turn a country of 11 million people into a continent-wide flight school. The logic behind it was sound. Canada had what Britain desperately needed and could not provide for itself. It had vast open spaces, flat prairie land stretching uninterrupted for hundreds of miles, skies that were empty and wide enough for novice pilots to learn without crashing into the geography of a crowded island. It had distance from the fighting. No Luftwaffe bombers would appear over Saskatchewan. No air raid sirens would interrupt a navigation exercise, and it had proximity to the industrial capacity of the United States, which could supply engines, instruments, and complete airframes faster than a wartime Britain, whose factories were already running at full tilt to keep the Royal Air Force in the fight. But the scale of what was being proposed was staggering. Before the war, the Royal Canadian Air Force was a small organization. It had fewer than 4,000 personnel. It owned fewer than a dozen airfields. Its annual pilot training capacity was measured in the low hundreds. Now it was being asked to train tens of thousands. Not in years to come, immediately. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King had complex reasons for supporting the plan. He needed to demonstrate to English Canada that the nation was making a serious contribution to the war effort. He also needed to avoid the conscription crises that had torn the country apart in the First World War. An air training plan conducted on home soil fit both requirements. It demanded massive effort, created thousands of jobs, and channeled Canadian resources into a visible war contribution that did not immediately require sending ground infantry into the trenches of Europe. The British, for their part, initially assumed they would absorb all trained aircrews into the Royal Air Force, as they had done in the previous war. King resisted. He insisted that Canadian graduates be identified by their national shoulder badges, that Canadian aircrew serve in identifiably Canadian squadrons wherever possible. It was a negotiation about sovereignty as much as logistics. Canada was a young nation. Only 8 years earlier it had gained full legal autonomy from Britain through the Statute of Westminster. The BCATP was, in a way, a declaration that this was a partnership, not a command relationship. The agreement was signed in the early hours of December 17, 1939. King had timed the announcement to coincide with his 65th birthday. He wanted the symbolism, and in the spring of 1940, the first recruits were accepted into the program at No. 1 Initial Training School in Toronto. What followed was construction on a scale that dwarfed anything Canada had attempted before. Within 2 years, architects, engineers, and laborers scouted, surveyed, and built more than 150 new airfields from coast to coast. Training schools opened in every province. Air observer schools, elementary flying training schools, service flying training schools, bombing and gunnery schools, wireless schools, navigation schools, and flying instructor schools appeared in places that had never seen anything more than a dirt landing strip. The government constructed over 7,000 hangars, barracks, and drill halls. Enough concrete was poured into runways across the country to build a 20-foot-wide highway from Ottawa to Vancouver. The numbers, as they accumulated, were unlike anything the country had experienced. Towns across the prairies that were still reeling from the Depression suddenly found themselves hosting military populations that rivaled or exceeded their civilian ones. 1,500 trainees and staff descended on small Manitoba communities like Virden, Neepawa, and Souris. Local economies that had been running on empty for a decade were flooded with paychecks, construction contracts, and the daily commerce of feeding, housing, and entertaining hundreds of young men who were far from home. The BCATP was designed not merely as a single school, but as a pipeline. Recruits entered at one end as civilians and emerged at the other as qualified aircrew. First came the Manning Depot, where they learned the fundamentals of military life. Then the initial training school, where mathematics, navigation, aerodynamics, and meteorology were drilled into them. From there, those destined for pilot training moved to elementary flying training schools, where they touched the controls of an aircraft for the first time. Those who survived that stage advanced to service flying training schools, where they were separated into streams. Future fighter pilots flew the demanding Harvard. Future bomber pilots learned multi-engine work on the twin-engined Avro Anson or Cessna crane. Navigators, wireless operators, air gunners, and bomb aimers each had their own specialized schools. And at the end, operational training units prepared them for the specific aircraft types they would fly in combat, often Hurricanes, Mosquitoes, or Liberators. It was relentless, it was systematic, and it was efficient. By its peak in late 1943, the BCATP comprised over 100,000 administrative personnel operating 107 schools and 184 ancillary units at 231 locations. Nearly 11,000 aircraft were in active use. 3,000 trainees graduated every month, and the pipeline kept feeding the air forces of 4 nations. The human cost of that efficiency was real. Training was dangerous. Cadets flew aircraft that were forgiving but not foolproof, in weather that shifted fast over the prairies, in airspace shared by dozens of other student pilots. 856 trainees died in crashes during the 5 years of the program. Their names are etched on a memorial in Brandon, Manitoba. They never saw combat. They were still learning. But the BCATP worked. By the time it formally ended in March of 1945, it had graduated 131,553 aircrew, pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, air gunners, and flight engineers from Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and more than a dozen other nations, including France, Czechoslovakia, Norway, Poland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Nearly half of all aircrew who served in British and Commonwealth flying operations during the entire war had been trained in Canada. President Franklin Roosevelt, borrowing the cadence of his own phrase about the American arsenal of democracy, called Canada something else entirely. He called it the aerodrome of democracy. No one who used that phrase imagined what would happen to that aerodrome when the war was done. Subscribe if you want more hidden WWII histories told carefully. To understand the disposal crisis that followed, you first have to understand what filled the airfields. The BCATP did not run on one type of aircraft. It ran on dozens, and the sheer variety reflected a training system that had to take a farm boy from Manitoba or a shop clerk from Melbourne and turn him into someone capable of flying a four-engined bomber through flak over the Ruhr or navigating a coastal command patrol across 600 miles of North Atlantic, or dropping ordnance within 100 yards of a target at night. The first aircraft a student pilot touched was often a de Havilland Tiger Moth. It was a biplane, open cockpit, or in the Canadian version, a cockpit fitted with a sliding canopy and heater to cope with winters that could kill an exposed pilot before his engine failed. The Tiger Moth was designed in 1931 as a primary trainer for the RAF, and it was one of the most produced training aircraft in history. More than 1,700 were built in Canada alone, designated the DH-82C, with modifications that included wheel brakes, a tail wheel, and a more powerful Gypsy Major engine. Tiger Moths and Fleet Finches handled all elementary flight training for the BCATP until the summer of 1942, with Tiger Moths outnumbering Finches by more than 3-to-1. The Tiger Moth was forgiving. It could recover from a spin by itself if the student had enough altitude. That forgiveness kept a great many young men alive during those first terrifying hours in the sky, when they were learning not just how to fly, but how to think in 3 dimensions while their hands shook and their stomachs lurched. 120 Tiger Moths were once based at Boundary Bay alone, near Vancouver. Imagine the sound. Imagine the sky over a single airfield humming with the drone of 100 small engines as students practiced circuits, stalls, side slips, and their first tentative solos. From elementary training, pilots moved on to more powerful and complex machines. Those selected for the single-engine fighter stream flew the North American Harvard, an advanced trainer that had earned the nickname the Pilot Maker. The Harvard was louder, faster, heavier, and far less forgiving than the Tiger Moth. It had retractable landing gear, a variable pitch propeller, and a 600-horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp engine that could kill an inattentive student in a heartbeat. Over 1,000 Mark IIs were delivered to the RCAF directly from North American Aviation. Then Nordøyne Aviation of Montreal, better known for building the legendary Norseman bush plane, began producing the Harvard underlicense and delivered nearly 2,800 Mark II-Bs to the RCAF and RAF between 1940 and 1945. Harvard served at 15 service flying training schools across the nation. For the multi-engine stream, the aircraft of choice were the Avro Anson and the Cessna Crane. The Anson, known as Faithful, Annie, or the Flying Greenhouse, was a twin-engined British design that had originally served as a light bomber and coastal patrol aircraft before being repurposed for training. The Canadian-built Mark II version, constructed with plywood to save strategic metals, was produced in factories in Nova Scotia and Ontario. Over 1,800 were built domestically. The Cessna Crane, the T-50 in American service, and sometimes called the Bamboo Bomber for its largely wooden construction, was an American civilian design that the RCAF adopted out of desperation when British trainers could not arrive fast enough. Over 800 cranes eventually served with the RCAF, primarily at service flying training schools in Western Canada. These were the core types, but the BCATP ecosystem also included ferry battles used for bombing and gunnery training, fleet forts, Bolingbroks, Lysanders for Army cooperation exercises, and later operational types like Hurricanes, Mosquitoes, and Liberators at the operational training units that served as the final step before overseas deployment. At the plan's peak, nearly 11,000 aircraft operated across the country. On a clear summer day in 1942 or 43, 200 or more bright yellow training planes might be buzzing the skies over or near a single city like Calgary, where 5 BCATP flying training bases operated simultaneously. The variety of types ranged from elementary biplanes with a cruising speed of 100 miles per hour to high-performance Harvards that could reach over 200. This was not a single air force operating a unified fleet. It was an industrial-scale production line where the product was human skill and the raw materials were fuel, airframes, instructors, and time. Every one of those airframes required maintenance. Every engine burned oil. Every propeller needed inspection. Every undercarriage had a finite number of landings before something gave. The logistical infrastructure to keep 11,000 aircraft flying simultaneously while absorbing the damage done by thousands of student pilots learning through error was itself a colossal enterprise. Canada had built a flying nation. From coast to coast, the sky hummed. And on the ground, every hangar, every parts depot, every repair shop, every fuel storage facility was running at capacity to keep the pipeline moving. No one was yet asking what would happen to all of it when the pipeline stopped. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The war in the Pacific ended 3 months later on August 15th, but the BCATP had already begun to wind down before either date. As early as November 1943, planners in Ottawa recognized that the training pipeline was producing more graduates than the front lines could absorb. Schools began closing. Intakes were reduced. By March 31, 1945, the plan officially terminated. Its mandate was complete. The speed of the shutdown was disorienting. Stations that had been running at full capacity, with aircraft in the air from first light to last, with classrooms full and barracks occupied, went quiet within weeks. Instructors were released. Ground crews were demobilized. Administrative staff processed their own discharge papers. The vast civilian support structure that had grown up around each base, the canteen workers, the maintenance contractors, the local businesses that depended on base paychecks, watched the population drain away like water from a cracked basin. At Portage-la-Prairie in Manitoba, No. 7 Air Observer School closed on the last day of March 1945, matching the exact date of the BCATP's termination. A navigation school opened immediately afterward, but it lasted only 5 months before it too disbanded. A manning depot relocated to the base in early 1946 to recruit new pilots for the peacetime RCAF, but closed within a year. The station lingered, occupied briefly by a storage depot and a radio propagation unit before falling to a skeleton caretaker staff. By 1949, control of the airfield was transferred to the Federal Department of Transportation. The RCAF was done with it. This pattern repeated everywhere. At Estevan in Saskatchewan, the flying club that formed at the former base after the war could not sustain the infrastructure it inherited. The airport eventually closed entirely, and the property was sold to a power corporation for a coal mine. Nothing remains of the aerodrome today. At the former RCAF detachment Alliston in Ontario, the land was simply sold and returned to its original function as farmland. Not the slightest trace remains. The human transition was just as abrupt. Tens of thousands of RCAF personnel needed to return to civilian life. Many of them were young men who had spent their entire adult lives inside the military training system. They had skills, certainly. They could fly or navigate or operate complex radio equipment. But the peacetime economy of 1945 had no immediate use for thousands of additional pilots. The airlines were small. The bush flying industry, while growing, could absorb only a fraction. And the infrastructure that had trained them was now itself the problem, because the bases did not just have buildings, they had aircraft, thousands of them. And aircraft do not sit quietly. They rust, they corrode, their engines seize if not properly preserved. Their fabric coverings rot if left exposed to prairie weather. Their instruments drift. Their tires flatten. Their wooden structures absorb moisture and develop rot that is invisible until structural failure. An aircraft sitting unused is not an asset resting. It is an asset decaying, and the cost of preventing that decay is not zero. It requires personnel, supplies, covered storage, and constant attention. The RCAF found itself in possession of a fleet it no longer needed and could not afford to maintain. The training mission was over. The operational squadrons were being drawn down to peacetime levels, and the types that had filled the BCATP airfields, the Tiger Moths, the Harvards, the Ansons, the Cranes, the Fleet Finches and Fairy Battles, were training aircraft. They were not bombers. They were not fighters. They were not transports. They had been built for one purpose, and that purpose had been served. The silence that fell across those stations was not peaceful. It was the silence of a machine that had been running flat out for 5 years and had just been switched off. The inertia was enormous. The hangars were full, the flight lines were crowded, and no one was coming to fly. The numbers were staggering, and the math was unforgiving. Canada had produced over 16,000 aircraft during the war. That figure encompassed everything from bombers and fighters to the fleet of trainers that had sustained the BCATP. In addition, the country had received thousands more from Britain and the United States. The training plan alone had operated nearly 11,000 aircraft at its peak. Even with wartime attrition, crashes, write-offs, and aircraft declared unserviceable, the quantity that remained at war's end was immense. Storing an aircraft is not like parking a truck. A truck can sit in a field for months and start again with a new battery and some fresh fuel. An aircraft, especially a piston-engined aircraft from the 1940s, is a far more delicate machine than its rugged appearance suggests. The engine must be preserved against internal corrosion. Cylinders need to be treated with preservative oil. Magnetos must be removed or protected. Propeller hubs require greasing. Control cables need inspection for corrosion and fraying. Fabric-covered surfaces, common on trainers like the tiger moth and the crane, are vulnerable to ultraviolet degradation and moisture damage. Wooden structures in the Anson and the crane absorb humidity and can develop hidden rot that compromises the airframe without any visible external sign. If an aircraft is to be stored temporarily with the expectation of future use, it requires what the military calls preservation and mothballing. This is labor-intensive. It requires skilled technicians, specific supplies, and covered or at least weather-protected storage. If it is to be maintained in flyable condition, the costs multiply. Engines must be run periodically. Flight controls must be exercised. Tires and hydraulic seals must be checked. Insurance must be maintained. Airworthiness inspections must be conducted. The RCAF did not have the personnel to do this at scale. Demobilization was draining the service of exactly the mechanics, riggers, and fitters who would have been needed to care for a fleet in storage. The budget was collapsing. Wartime spending authorities expired. Peacetime appropriations were a fraction of what had been available during the conflict. And the Treasury was clear. Canada had spent approximately $1.6 billion on the BCATP alone, nearly 3/4 of the program's total cost. The war was over. The spending had to stop. So the aircraft sat. On flight lines, in hangars, on grass strips, on concrete pads. They sat in the weather. they sat in the wind. They sat in the cold of Canadian winters that could crack engine blocks and split wooden structures. They sat in the heat of prairie summers that baked fabric coverings and warped canopies. Every week they sat, they depreciated. Every month, the cost of restoring them to flyable condition increased, while their value to anyone who might buy them decreased. The government faced a paradox. Keeping the aircraft was expensive. Selling them required a system. Scrapping them required labor. And ignoring them was not an option, because thousands of unattended aircraft scattered across 150 airfields was not just an economic problem. It was a logistical embarrassment. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly because the clock of entropy was already running. The Canadian government had seen this problem coming, or at least some of its planners had. In 1944, while the war was still raging, Parliament established the War Assets Corporation. The WAC was a Crown company, a government-owned entity with a specific mandate to manage the disposal of surplus military equipment and other assets that would become redundant when the fighting stopped. It was created precisely because the experience after the First World War had been disastrous. In 1919, surplus disposal had been chaotic, uncoordinated, and vulnerable to profiteering. Policymakers in the 40s looked back on that precedent and saw only failures and mistakes. They were determined not to repeat them. The War Assets Corporation operated under principles that were designed to prevent economic disruption. It could not simply dump millions of dollars worth of military goods onto the open market. That would have cratered prices in multiple industries simultaneously. It could not sell directly to the public in most cases because that would have undercut the businesses and retailers who were trying to rebuild a civilian economy. Instead, the WAC functioned as a wholesale distributor. It collected surplus materiel from declaring agencies, primarily the Department of National Defense. It appraised, cataloged, and priced the goods, and then it sold them through established trade channels to manufacturers, dealers, and retailers who would recondition, repackage, and resell them to end users. The scope of the WWII's task was enormous. Canada had produced not just aircraft, but 800 ships, 800,000 military pattern vehicles, 50,000 armored vehicles, 1.5 million firearms, and millions of uniforms. The liquidation of all this was described at the time as the largest and most complex distributive operation ever undertaken by a government. For aircraft, the process was particularly complicated. Each type had different characteristics, different civilian potential, and different regulatory hurdles. A Harvard could, in theory, be flown by a civilian with the right license, but it had to be inspected, certified, and registered. Military radio equipment had to be removed. Armament provisions had to be stripped. The airframe had to be assessed for remaining useful life because a trainer that had been flown hard by students for 4 years was not in the same condition as one that had spent the war in a storage depot. The WAC's aircraft division worked with the Department of National Defense for Air to establish categories. Some aircraft were declared surplus and repairable, meaning they could potentially be reconditioned for sale. Others were surplus and unserviceable, meaning they had reached the end of their useful life and were suitable only for parts recovery or scrapping. Still, others fell into gray zones where the cost of reconditioning exceeded the likely sale price, leaving the WAC to decide whether it was worth the effort. Pricing was an art as much as a science. The WAC had to balance recovering value for the Crown against the risk of flooding the market. A tiger moth that had cost the government several $1,000s to acquire and maintain during the war might be sold for a few hundred. A Cessna crane, its wooden structure potentially compromised by years of service, might sell for even less. The gap between what the government had paid and what it could recover was enormous, but the alternative, letting the aircraft rot on the ramp, recovered nothing at all. The WWII did not operate retail storefronts where ordinary citizens could walk in and buy an airplane. In most cases, surplus aircraft were sold through dealers and established businesses that had experience with aviation. Flying clubs, commercial operators, and aviation companies could submit offers or participate in the limited auction sales that were occasionally authorized. The system was bureaucratic. It was slow, it was frequently criticized, but it was deliberate. And behind the frustration of veterans who wanted to buy cheap surplus planes and civilians who resented the middlemen, there was a machinery grinding forward, processing the remnants of the greatest air training program the world had ever seen, and trying to convert them from instruments of war into something, anything, of peacetime value. The ghost airfields appeared almost overnight. One season, a base might be operating at full capacity, 50 aircraft on the flight line, instructors in the mess, ground crew in the hangars, the control tower staffed. The next season, it would be a storage depot, or worse, simply abandoned, with the buildings locked, the hangars empty or half full of grounded trainers, and the runways cracking in the freeze-thaw cycle of a prairie winter with no one left to maintain them. The transition from active training base to surplus holding pen was neither graceful nor planned for the long term. In many cases, the bases had been built in a hurry. The concrete was adequate for wartime training, but not designed for decades of use. The buildings were utilitarian, wooden barracks, corrugated steel hangars, cinder block drill halls. They were built to last the war. When the war ended, they began to deteriorate almost immediately. At stations across the prairies, aircraft that had once flown daily were now parked in rows and left under open sky. Trainers that had been painted bright yellow to make them visible in the air now faded toward white and gray under the ultraviolet bombardment of prairie summers. Fabric coverings on ansons and cranes grew taut and then slack as the wood beneath them absorbed and released moisture with the seasons. Engines that had turned over every morning grew cold and stayed cold. Canopies that had been slid open by students reaching for the sky stayed shut, collecting dust on the inside and grime on the outside. The military equipment that had given these aircraft their wartime identity was stripped systematically. Radios were removed. Bomb sights, where applicable, were pulled. Gun turrets on ansons were taken off. Anything classified or sensitive was extracted before an aircraft could be declared surplus and made available for disposal. What remained was the airframe, the engine, and the instruments. A skeleton that looked like an airplane but was no longer quite one. At some bases, the stripping and cataloging process was orderly. At others, it was less so. The speed of demobilization meant that some aircraft were simply pushed into parking areas without thorough preservation work. Engines that should have been inhibited with preservative oil were left untreated. Control locks that should have been installed were missing. Tires went flat and stayed flat, the weight of the aircraft resting on rims that slowly deformed. For the small communities that had hosted these bases, the ghost airfields were monuments to something that had been taken away. The economic boom that had come with the BCATP vanished as quickly as it had arrived. Local economies that had adjusted to the presence of hundreds or thousands of military personnel found themselves overbuilt and underpopulated. Businesses that had thrived on base traffic closed. Barracks that had housed airmen from London, Sydney, Auckland, and Cape Town stood empty. At Swift Current, in Saskatchewan, which had been a large training base with 3 sets of parallel runways, what remained after the war was a crumbling airfield and some hangar pads. At Alliston in Ontario, the former aerodrome was sold and returned to farmland. Not the slightest trace remained. At the Cairn Aerodrome in Saskatchewan, which had served as a relief landing field, the site was taken over in 1946 by a Bible Institute and renamed Cairnport. The drill hall became a recreation center. Part of an H-hut became a laundromat. The lower runway and a taxiway were eventually repurposed as streets for trailer homes. These were places where men had learned to fly, where they had made their first solos, their first night landings, their first crosswind approaches in little biplanes that rattled and swayed in the prairie wind, where they had formed friendships that would carry them through the terror of operational flying over occupied Europe, where some of them had died, not in combat, but in the simple and unforgiving act of learning. Now the fields were quiet. The wind moved through empty hangars and made sounds that no one was there to hear. Not every aircraft went to the scrap heap. Some found second lives. The post-war years created a strange and brief window in Canadian aviation. Thousands of trained pilots had returned from the war or been released from the training system. Many of them wanted to keep flying. At the same time, the Canadian North was experiencing a development boom. Mining companies needed aerial surveys, forestry operations needed fire patrols, remote communities needed supply flights, and the bush flying industry, which had been the backbone of northern aviation before the war, was expanding rapidly to meet the demand. The War Assets Corporation, for all its bureaucratic friction, was releasing aircraft onto the civilian market, and some of those aircraft, despite their military origins and the wear of wartime training, were perfectly serviceable for civilian use. They were cheap. A surplus trainer that might have cost the government several $1,000s could be had for a fraction of that. For a returning veteran with a pilot's license and a discharge gratuity, or a small operator looking to expand, the economics were irresistible. Tiger moths found new homes with flying clubs across the country. The same aircraft that had taught cadets their first stalls and spins now carried weekend aviators on recreational flights. Some went to agricultural work. In New Zealand, large numbers of ex-military Tiger moths were converted into top-dressing aircraft, pioneering the use of airplanes in agriculture. In Canada, the conversion was less systematic, but Tiger moths and other light types found their way into crop dusting, aerial spraying, and similar work. The Harvard, despite being a military advanced trainer, proved adaptable. Its powerful Pratt and Whitney engine and robust construction made it useful for a variety of civilian roles. Some were purchased by flying schools that continued pilot training in the post-war period. Others became personal aircraft for wealthy enthusiasts. The RCAF itself retained a number of Harvards for continued use as trainers in the peacetime Air Force, though it later regretted selling off so many when the Cold War created a sudden renewed demand for training aircraft, and it had to scramble to lease American T-6 Texans and order new production Harvards from Canadian Car and Foundry. The Cessna Crane, retired from RCAF service by 1947, entered civilian life through private sales. Some were purchased by small commercial operators who used them for light transport in remote areas. One, sold to Canadian Aviation Industries after the war, eventually ended up with Matane Air Service, which flew it commercially along the isolated St. Lawrence North Shore of Quebec. The Norseman, while not a BCATP trainer in the strict sense, was a wartime type that benefited enormously from the surplus market. Hundreds of military Norsemen came onto the market at war's end, and as the Canadian wilderness boom took hold, they were snapped up by bush operators who prized the aircraft's ruggedness, payload capacity, and ability to operate on wheels, floats, or skis. These second lives were real. They mattered. A surplus trainer that became a charter plane in northern Ontario carried passengers and freight that connected communities to the outside world. A former Harvard that became a flying school's workhorse trained a generation of peacetime pilots who would go on to build Canada's commercial aviation industry. The skills and the machines of the BCATP did not simply evaporate, they dispersed, they diffused into the fabric of a growing nation. But for every aircraft that found a buyer and a purpose, there were many more that did not. The civilian market could absorb only so many surplus trainers. The costs of conversion, inspection, and certification were barriers that kept many airframes grounded, and for types like the Avro Anson, which the RCAF declared obsolete at war's end, the prospects were particularly grim. The Mark II Anson, with its plywood construction and relatively low performance, had limited civilian appeal. The conversion economics did not work. The market did not want them. Those aircraft had a different future, and it did not involve flying. The scrappers came for what the market would not take. Across Canada, at bases that had once been loud with the sound of engines, a different kind of work began. Men with tools and torches dismantled the aircraft that no one wanted. They cut through aluminum skin. They pulled engines from mounts. They stripped wiring harnesses and hydraulic lines. They reduced airframes to their component metals, separating steel from aluminum, copper from brass, recovering what could be melted down and reused. The Avro Anson was hit hardest. The RCAF had declared the type obsolete. The Canadian-built Mark II, constructed largely of plywood and fabric over a wooden frame, had limited scrap value even as raw material. It could not be economically converted for civilian use. The engines were worth something. The instruments had some residual value, but the airframe itself was often worth more as firewood than as aircraft structure. At Claresholm in Alberta, local farmers bought some of the decommissioned Ansons for parts, salvaging electrical and mechanical systems for farm machinery repairs. The airframes of aircraft that had trained navigators to cross the Atlantic were reduced to components that helped run grain elevators and irrigation pumps. This was not dramatic. It was not photographed for posterity. It was ordinary peacetime work, carried out by men who needed jobs and saw an opportunity in the mountains of surplus material that the government was desperate to move. Scrap dealers bid on lots of aircraft. Wrecking crews arrived at bases and worked through them systematically. Wings came off. Fuselages were cut into sections. Engine cowlings were stacked. Propellers were removed and stored or sold separately. The aluminum recovered from scrapped aircraft re-entered the supply chain. Wartime Canada had developed an extensive aluminum industry largely to support aircraft production, and the post-war economy found uses for reclaimed metal in consumer goods, construction, and industrial applications. The circle was complete. Metal that had been mined, smelted, and formed into aircraft skin during the war was now being recovered, melted, and reformed into the products of peace. But the scale of the scrapping was difficult to grasp. Thousands of airframes were reduced to materials. The yellow paint that had identified them as trainers was scraped and sanded away. The serial numbers that had tracked their careers through dozens of schools and hundreds of students were obliterated. The logbooks that recorded their hours, their maintenance, their accidents, and their pilots were filed away in archives or simply lost. Each aircraft that was cut apart had a history. It had been flown by men whose names were recorded somewhere, in documents that might survive or might not. A Tiger Moth that was scrapped at a prairie depot might have carried the first solo of a pilot who later flew Lancasters over Berlin. A crane that was dismantled for parts might have trained a man who navigated convoy escort patrols across the North Atlantic. The connection between the training aircraft and the men who flew them operationally was real but invisible. The aircraft were the first chapter of stories that ended over Europe, over the Pacific, or in the quiet decades of post-war life. And now those first chapters were being erased, airframe by airframe, lot by lot. The wartime fleet shrank rapidly. By the late 1940s, the vast majority of BCATP aircraft had been disposed of through one channel or another. Sold, scrapped, converted, donated, or simply abandoned in place, and eventually absorbed by the landscape. The 11,000 aircraft that had filled the skies over Canada during the peak of the training plan were reduced to a remnant. A few hundred in RCAF service, a few hundred more in civilian hands, and the rest were gone. The speed of it was remarkable. The system that Canada had built over 5 years to acquire, maintain, and operate thousands of training aircraft was dismantled in roughly 2. The pipeline ran in reverse. The airfields followed the aircraft into oblivion, not all at once, not uniformly, but steadily, across the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the stations that had been the physical infrastructure of the BCATP were closed, repurposed, abandoned, or returned to their pre-war state. The process was as varied as the country itself. Some bases became municipal airports. The runways, the hangars, the control towers that the federal government had built were transferred to local authorities or the Department of Transport. In these cases, the BCATP left a tangible legacy. Towns that had never had proper airfields before the war now had them, complete with paved runways and permanent structures. The classic BCATP airfield, with its 3 runways arranged in a triangle so that training aircraft could always land into the wind, became the template for a generation of small Canadian airports. That triangular outline is still visible today at locations like Claresholm, preserved in the geometry of runways that were last used for training more than 80 years ago. Other bases had less fortunate afterlives. Many simply closed and were sold to private owners or other government departments. The land, much of it requisitioned from farmers during the war, reverted to agricultural use. Runways were torn up or left to crack and crumble. Hangars were repurposed as barns, workshops, or storage facilities for agricultural equipment. The drill halls became community centers or church halls. The barracks were demolished or moved to other locations for reuse as residential or commercial buildings. At Rivers in Manitoba, the base continued in military service for decades after the war, eventually closing in 1971. The land was turned over to the Department of Indian Affairs and became a vocational training center. One hangar became a fertilizer storage facility. The runways, listed as abandoned, continued to see occasional use by aerial spraying and firefighting operators, but the military presence that had defined the place for 30 years was gone. At Estevan in Saskatchewan, the former base went through a succession of post-military uses before the airport closed entirely in 1989, and the property was sold for a coal mine. A new airport was built north of town. Nothing of the original aerodrome survives. At Moose Jaw in Saskatchewan, the base survived into the post-war era and remains active today as a training facility, one of the few BCATP sites to maintain continuous military aviation use. But Moose Jaw is the exception. Most BCATP stations did not persist. The infrastructure that dissolved was not trivial. Over 7,000 buildings had been constructed. Hundreds of miles of water mains and sewer lines had been laid. Fuel storage facilities holding millions of gallons had been built. Road networks connecting isolated airfields to nearby towns had been graded and paved. All of this had been built quickly with wartime urgency and wartime budgets, and much of it was not designed to outlast the conflict. When the maintenance stopped, the deterioration was rapid. Prairie weather is not gentle. Winters crack concrete and split wood. Summers bake and warp. Wind erodes exposed surfaces. Rain penetrates neglected roofs. Within a decade of the war's end, many former BCATP stations were recognizable only by their runway outlines, visible from the air as geometric patterns etched into farmland that had grown back over the pavement. The communities that had hosted these bases were left with mixed legacies. Some benefited permanently from the improved infrastructure, the roads, the airfields, the buildings that could be adapted for civilian use. Others were left with surplus structures they could not afford to maintain and did not need. The economic boom of the wartime years had been real but temporary. When it ended, the small towns of the prairies returned to the rhythms that had governed them before the war, rhythms of agriculture, weather, and distance. But something had changed. The BCATP had connected these isolated communities to the world in ways that were unprecedented. Young men from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and a dozen other nations had walked their streets, eaten in their restaurants, danced at their socials, and sometimes married their daughters. Over 3,700 Canadian women married members of foreign forces who had been stationed in Canada during the war. Those human connections outlasted the airfields by decades. The concrete crumbled, the hangars rusted, the stories persisted, carried in letters, photographs, and the memories of people who had been young when the sky was full of yellow airplanes and the future was uncertain. Of the nearly 11,000 aircraft that operated under the BCATP at its peak, and the thousands more that passed through the system over the plan's 5-year lifespan, a vanishingly small number survive today. The arithmetic of preservation tells its own story. Of the more than 1,700 Tiger moths built in Canada, approximately 40 remain in flying condition in the country today. The rest were scrapped, crashed, worn out, or lost to the slow attrition of decades. A few are preserved in museums. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton has one, restored over 5 years in the late 1970s. The Saskatchewan Aviation Museum has another. The Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada in Winnipeg holds a tiger moth that was based at RCAF Station Neepawa during the war. After the BCATP ended, it functioned as a working airplane, patrolling range fences and rounding up lost cattle on a ranch near Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. A biplane that trained men to fly, over-occupied Europe spent its retirement chasing livestock. Harvards fared somewhat better, partly because the type remained in RCAF service until 1966, giving the airframes an extended operational life that delayed their entry into the surplus market. Countless privately owned Harvards are still flying today, maintained by enthusiasts and organizations like the Canadian Harvard Aircraft Association, which preserves and flies the type as a living memorial to the BCATP. But the total number of surviving Harvards is small relative to the thousands that were built. The Cessna crane is among the rarest BCATP survivors. Its wooden construction made it particularly vulnerable to deterioration, and relatively few were preserved. The Bomber Command Museum of Canada at Nanton, Alberta, holds one that was restored to taxiable condition from one of 3 cranes acquired by a rancher near Lundbreck, Alberta. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum has another, which saw post-war civilian service in the isolated North Shore region of Quebec before being donated to the museum in 1976. The Avro Anson, despite being one of the most numerous types in the BCATP, is extremely rare in preserved form. The plywood construction of the Canadian Mark II made long-term survival unlikely. The Commonwealth Air Training Plan Museum in Brandon, Manitoba, holds disassembled Anson components among its collection, which it describes as the largest BCATP inventory in Canada. That museum, the only one in the world dedicated solely to the history of the air training plan, holds 14 aircraft on display, along with hundreds of parts, incomplete airframes, and engines in storage. It is located in Manitoba, where so much of the training was carried out, and it exists because of volunteers who understood that the physical evidence of the BCATP was disappearing. The memorial landscape is thin. The Ottawa Memorial, unveiled by Queen Elizabeth II in 1959, commemorates by name approximately 800 men and women who lost their lives while serving or training with Commonwealth Air Forces in Canada, the West Indies, and the United States, and who have no known grave. At CFB Trenton, wrought iron memorial gates presented by Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom in 1949 commemorate the wartime partnership. At Brandon, the BCATP Memorial is etched with the names of over 19,000 airmen and airwomen from Canada and the Commonwealth who died in the war. But these are memorials to people, not to machines. The aircraft themselves, the vehicles that carried these men and women into the sky and that symbolized Canada's vast contribution to the Allied cause, are almost entirely gone. The paper trail, the logbooks, the service records, the maintenance files is far larger than the number of surviving airframes. In archives across the country, documents record the serial numbers, the postings, the hours flown, and the fates of thousands of aircraft that no longer exist in physical form. The records survive. The machines do not. This gap, between the documentary evidence of an enormous enterprise and the near-total absence of its physical remains, is one of the defining characteristics of the BCATP's legacy. It was too big to be preserved. It was too ordinary to be monumentalized. The trainers were workhorses, not glamorous fighters or iconic bombers. They did not appear in newsreels or on recruiting posters. They were the unglamorous first step in a pipeline that ended, for most of the men who flew them, in operational squadrons far from Canada. By the time those men came home, if they came home, the trainers they had learned on were already gone. Return to that prairie airfield, Saskatchewan, 1946. The trainers sit in their rows, wingtip to wingtip, silent and still. The yellow paint is fading, the engines are cold, the wind moves through the gap between the fuselages with a low, hollow sound, and no one is there to hear it. This is where it began for thousands of young men. This is where they first felt an aircraft lift away from the earth, where the prairie dropped below them and the horizon stretched to infinity, where the instructors' steady hands corrected their mistakes and their own shaking hands slowly grew confident. This is where they learned that flight was not magic but mechanics, not instinct but discipline, not courage but repetition, until the thing that had seemed impossible became automatic. In a span of 5 extraordinary years, Canada built one of the largest air training networks in history. A nation of 11 million people constructed over 200 training sites in 9 provinces, built 7,000 structures, operated nearly 11,000 aircraft, employed over 100,000 personnel, and graduated more than 131,000 aircrew from dozens of nations. It spent $1.6 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum for a country that had been mired in depression less than a decade earlier. It earned the title of Aerodrome of Democracy, and it earned it completely. And then, with equal speed and equal determination, it dismantled the whole thing. The aircraft were catalogued, appraised, and fed into the disposal machinery of the War Assets Corporation. Some were sold to flying clubs and bush operators who gave them second careers in the peacetime sky. Some were bought by small companies and private owners who saw opportunity in a surplus that measured in thousands. Some were shipped overseas or transferred to allied nations, and many, the majority, were simply scrapped, cut apart, melted down, reduced to aluminum ingots and steel billets and the anonymous raw materials of a post-war economy that was building refrigerators, automobiles, and suburban houses with the same metal that had once formed wing spars and engine cowlings. The airfields closed, the hangars emptied, the runways cracked, and were reclaimed by prairie grass and wheat fields. Communities that had been transformed by the sudden arrival of the military returned to their former rhythms, carrying the memory of a time when the world had come to their doorstep and then departed. Some former bases became municipal airports. Others became farms, industrial parks, Bible colleges, or simply fields where the outline of three intersecting runways could still be seen from the air if you knew where to look. Today, a handful of museums preserve the physical remnants. A tiger moth in Hamilton, a Harvard in Brandon, a crane near Nanton, an Anson reduced to components in a warehouse, 40 flying tiger moths in all of Canada, from 1700 built. Volunteers keep them airworthy, not because the aircraft are intrinsically valuable, but because they are the last tangible connection to an enterprise that shaped the war and the nation and then disappeared so completely that most Canadians have never heard of it. The paper trail is vast. The archives hold hundreds of thousands of pages of records, serial numbers, flight logs, maintenance reports, accident investigations, training syllabi, personnel files. The documentary evidence of the BCATP is enormous, but the physical evidence, the aircraft, the buildings, the infrastructure, has been reduced to a remnant so small that it seems impossible that it was ever so large. This is the nature of wartime mobilization. It is built to be temporary. The urgency that created it does not survive the peace. The budgets that funded it do not survive the armistice. The political will that sustained it does not survive the election cycle. And the machines, the thousands of machines that were by peace, processed by bureaucracy, sold by peace, processed by bureaucracy, sold for pennies, scrapped for metal, absorbed by a landscape that had no further use for runways and no memory of the men who had walked them. What remains is quieter than silence. It is the absence of something that was once overwhelming. 11,000 aircraft, 200 airfields, 131,000 graduates, a continent reshaped by the sound of engines that no longer turn. The wind still moves across those prairie fields. The wheat still grows where the hangars stood. And somewhere in an archive, in a logbook never opened, the serial number of a yellow biplane records the hours it flew, the students it carried, and the date it was struck from the register. That is all that is left, a number on a page and the wind.